All right, welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Definitely. Always excited to dig into these fascinating topics.
Me too. And today we're taking a look at presidential powers in the United States.
Big topic. Where are we starting with this one?
Well, our sources for this deep dive actually compare the president's role to a ship captain.
Oh, interesting. I can see how that analogy might work.
Yeah, navigating the country, making tough calls, it all kind of fits.
Definitely. Especially when you think about the whole executive power thing.
Right, the president leads the executive branch, carrying out laws, all that.
Exactly. But there are all these different types of powers the president has too, right?
Like express versus implied powers, that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, yeah. So express powers are those specifically laid out in the Constitution.
Like the captain's official orders,
Yeah.
straight from the rule book.
Exactly. And speaking of rule books, Article 2 of the Constitution is essentially that for the president.
Makes sense. So that's where we find those express powers
Yeah.
clearly defined.
Right. And one of the most important ones is the president's role as commander-in-chief of the armed forces.
Wow, that's a huge responsibility, especially in today's world.
Yeah. It's not just about leading troops into battle anymore. It's everything from cybersecurity to drone strikes, things the founding fathers couldn't have even imagined.
Talk about a tough job, making decisions that impact global security.
Right. And with all that power comes a lot of scrutiny, lots of checks and balances to consider.
We'll get to those checks and balances in a bit, but for now, let's stick with those express powers.
Okay, so besides commander-in-chief, the Constitution also gives the president the power to appoint key officials.
Oh, right, like the captain choosing their officers, building a team.
Yeah, but it's not a solo decision. The Senate has to approve those appointments.
Makes sense, like needing approval from headquarters before finalizing the crew.
Exactly. It ensures a broader consensus on who fills those vital roles.
Speaking of working with others, the president also has the express power to make treaties with other countries.
Another big one, and again, that requires the Senate's consent.
So, like, getting the green light before signing any major agreements with other ships, right?
Perfect analogy. And then we've got the power to pardon people convicted of federal crimes. That's a big one, too.
Wow, a get-out-of-jail-free card. That's some serious power.
It is, and it can be used for all sorts of reasons. It's sparked plenty of debate over the years.
Definitely. But for now, are there any other express powers we should cover?
Oh, one more crucial one. The president has to give Congress updates on the state of the country through the State of the Union address.
Ah, like the captain's log, keeping everyone informed about the journey.
Exactly. It's a chance for the president to lay out their agenda, highlight achievements, address challenges.
Okay, so we've covered those express powers, pretty clearly defined in the Constitution.
Now let's move on to the implied powers. Those are where things get really fascinating.
Oh yeah, those are the ones not directly stated, but kind of inferred from the president's role.
Think of it like reading between the lines of those captain's orders, figuring out what's necessary to actually carry them out.
That's where things get tricky, right? Determining what's implied versus what's overstepping.
Definitely, there's a lot of room for interpretation, and one of the biggest sources of implied powers is the take care clause.
The take care clause, it rings a bell. Remind me what that is again?
Sure, it's in Article 2 of the Constitution. It states that the president must take care that the laws be faithfully executed.
Okay, so the president has to ensure laws are enforced. That makes sense.
But faithfully executed, that's pretty open to interpretation, right?
Yeah. How much wiggle room does that give the president? Seems like a lot could fit under that.
That's the heart of it. The take care clause gives the president a lot of leeway in how to enforce laws passed by Congress.
It's like the captain having the authority to adjust course to navigate unexpected conditions, right?
Spot on. The president can't just create new laws, but they have a lot of flexibility in deciding how to put those laws into action.
So that's where we see things like executive agreements. Those deals the president makes with other countries without needing Senate approval.
You got it. That's a prime example of implied powers stemming from the president's role in foreign affairs combined with that take care clause.
Hold on, so the president can bypass Congress and make agreements with other countries. That seems like it could undermine the whole system of checks and balances.
It's a common criticism, definitely something to consider, but those who support executive agreements argue they're necessary for effective foreign policy.
Especially when you need to act quickly, maintain confidentiality, like in those sudden storms you mentioned.
Exactly. Our sources even highlight a president negotiating a formal treaty, needing Senate approval for that, but then using executive agreements for day-to-day diplomacy.
Okay, so the treaty sets the overall course. The executive agreements are those minor adjustments to keep things on track.
That's a good way to put it. It's a powerful tool, but definitely raises questions about accountability and transparency.
For sure, we're going to need to unpack that more, because if these agreements aren't going through the Senate, how can we be sure they're in the best interest of the country?
Excellent point. And that's a debate that's been raging for decades, one we'll definitely continue to explore in our next segment.
Sounds like we've got a lot more to cover. Can't wait to dive back in.
Same here. This is where things get really interesting. All right, so before we move on from those implied powers,
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there.
definitely, and I think it's worth circling back to that take care clause.
Okay, the one that gives the president all that leeway in how they enforce laws.
Exactly. It's the foundation for so many implied powers, but its interpretation has caused debate for centuries.
Makes sense. It seems like a pretty powerful clause.
Oh, it is, but to really understand it, we should probably revisit the actual text.
Good point. I'm a little fuzzy on the exact wording. What does it actually say?
The president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Seems simple enough, right?
Yeah, on the surface, it seems pretty straightforward.
But as we were saying earlier, that phrase faithfully executed is where things get interesting.
Right, because it leaves a lot open to interpretation.
Exactly. And that's where the tension lies, because on one hand, the president needs some flexibility, right?
Yeah, like to respond to crises, implement policies effectively. The world's constantly changing.
The Founding Fathers couldn't have predicted every scenario, so this clause gives the president the wiggle room to adapt.
I see what you mean. A rigid rule book wouldn't really work in the real world.
Nope, not at all. But then there's the flip side.
Which is,
Well, if the president has too much freedom to interpret and enforce laws based on their own preferences,
that could be a problem.
it could undermine the will of Congress, maybe even infringe on the rights of citizens. It's a delicate balance.
It's like walking a tightrope. You need enough flexibility to govern, but not so much that it leads to abuses of power.
Exactly. That's why having those checks and balances is so important. Plus, an informed and engaged citizenry to hold the president accountable.
So it's not just about the powers themselves, but the context in which they're used.
And the mechanisms that prevent their misuse. It's a dynamic system, not just a static list of powers.
This is reminding me of those historical examples we talked about before, like how different presidents have interpreted these powers in different ways.
Oh, absolutely. Our sources delve into some fascinating examples, starting with Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War.
Lincoln, wow, talk about a president who faced some incredible challenges.
He did, and his actions during that time really pushed the boundaries of presidential authority.
Like what, specifically?
Well, for instance, he imposed a blockade of Confederate ports without a formal declaration of war from Congress.
So he was acting decisively, using his power as commander-in-chief, even if it meant stretching the limits of what was considered acceptable at the time.
Exactly. He was navigating uncharted territory, doing what he thought was necessary to preserve the Union.
But I imagine that sparked some controversy, right?
Oh, absolutely. Some people argued he was overstepping his constitutional authority.
Makes sense. It's a tough call, weighing national security against those checks and balances.
And it didn't stop there. He also suspended the writ of habeas corpus in certain areas, allowing for the detention of individuals without trial.
Wow, that's a pretty drastic measure. What was the reasoning behind that?
He argued it was necessary to maintain order and security during wartime, but it definitely raised concerns about individual liberty versus national security.
Yeah, those are some fundamental questions about the balance of power. Questions that are still debated today.
They are, and Lincoln's actions set precedents that have shaped how we view executive power, especially during emergencies.
His presidency really highlights that ongoing tension between individual freedom and national security.
And the complexities of defining presidential authority in extraordinary times, it's a theme that runs throughout history.
It's amazing how decisions made so long ago can still resonate with how we view things today.
They do, but not every example is about war or national crisis. Our sources also highlight Franklin D. Roosevelt and his New Deal programs.
The New Deal, that was a massive shift in the role of the federal government.
It was. Facing the Great Depression, Roosevelt believed the government had a responsibility to intervene and help struggling citizens.
So he was using his powers to address a different kind of crisis, an economic one.
Exactly. He leveraged his appointment power to assemble a team that shared his vision.
And worked with Congress to create programs like Social Security, the Civilian Conservation Corps.
All aimed at relief, recovery, reform. It was a monumental shift.
But I bet it wasn't without its critics.
Of course not. His opponents argued he was exceeding his authority, overstepping the bounds of federal power.
Classic debate. How much should the government intervene? Where do you draw the line?
Right. It shows how presidential power can be used to address systemic issues, but it always comes with those questions about its limits.
It seems like no matter the era, there's always debate about how much power the president should have.
It's a constant negotiation, balancing different visions of the government's role and the president's place within that framework.
This is all so fascinating, but I'm curious to see how these historical examples connect to the modern presidency.
I agree. I think it's time to move beyond the history books and into the 21st century.
Yeah, let's see how these powers play out in a world that's so different from what the founding fathers could have imagined. Okay, so we've talked about express powers, implied powers, looked at some historical examples.
It's all been building up to this. How does presidential power function in the modern era?
Exactly. The world's a lot different now than it was back in the days of powdered wigs and quill pens.
You can say that again. Everything moves so much faster. Technology's changing everything.
It's like our ship analogy has been upgraded with warp drive and a whole new set of challenges.
Perfect way to put it. Leading in today's world requires a different kind of captain, that's for sure.
So where do we even begin to unpack how these modern challenges impact presidential power?
Well, our sources point to the presidency of George W. Bush as a prime example, specifically his response to the September 11th attacks.
9/11, yeah, that was a moment that really changed everything. A whole new kind of threat emerged.
It forced the Bush administration to grapple with some really tough questions, like how to respond to terrorism, how to protect the nation from future attacks.
And it wasn't just about traditional warfare anymore. It brought up issues of surveillance, intelligence gathering, that whole debate about national security versus individual liberties.
Absolutely. And Bush, invoking his authority as commander-in-chief, took decisive action, launching the war on terror, sending troops to Afghanistan and Iraq.
And of course, there was the Patriot Act, expanding the government's surveillance powers.
All in the name of national security. But these actions sparked intense debate, and they remain controversial to this day.
Some argued that these measures went too far, that they infringed upon civil liberties, expanded executive power too much.
It was, and continues to be, a balancing act, trying to ensure security without sacrificing freedom.
A dilemma that every president faces, especially during times of crisis. Where do you draw the line?
It's a tough question, and it only got more complicated as the war on terror went on, as technology advanced, as new tactics emerged.
That's where technology really comes into play, doesn't it? It's changed everything about how we live, how we communicate, how we wage war.
It's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it gives presidents incredible tools for intelligence gathering, communication, projecting military force.
But on the other hand, it raises all these concerns about privacy, government overreach, the potential for abuse.
We saw this play out in the debates surrounding the NSA surveillance programs. Those revelations really shook things up.
It forced us to confront the limits of executive power in the digital age, a conversation that's still ongoing.
And it's not just about technology either. Globalization has also had a huge impact on the presidency.
Yeah, it's a much more interconnected world. Presidents have to deal with international organizations, economic partnerships, global challenges.
Think about the COVID-19 pandemic. That was a perfect example of how one leader's decisions can have global repercussions.
It's like our ship analogy is now part of a massive fleet, all these ships interacting, affecting each other.
Exactly. It highlights the need for presidents who understand global affairs, who can build relationships with leaders from all over the world.
This has been an incredible journey, exploring the evolution of presidential power, from the founding of our nation to the complexities of the modern world.
We've covered a lot of ground, those express powers, the implied powers, the historical examples, the modern challenges.
It's clear that the presidency has evolved a lot over the years, and it continues to evolve.
But one thing remains constant: the importance of checks and balances, the need for an informed and engaged citizenry.
Because ultimately, the power rests with the people. We have a responsibility to understand these issues, to hold our leaders accountable.
To participate in the ongoing dialogue about the kind of nation we want to be, that's what makes democracy work.
So keep asking those tough questions, stay curious, stay engaged.
The future of our democracy depends on it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time, keep exploring.